Thanks everybody for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about the Kendo UI DataSource in particular. So as promised, I want to get straight to business without doing a lot of presentation and PowerPoints and slide decks. But just as a quick overview, the DataSource is the component that you will use when you're using Kendo UI. You'll find that many of the components in it are data bound. So these components are usually things that you would use to interact with remote data sources, local data sources potentially, and it would be cumbersome to try and figure out how to deal with data for each different component. So Kendo UI has a solution to that, and that is the Kendo DataSource. So to get started with it and how it works, the easiest way is, as usual, going to our dojo where you can start playing around with Kendo UI. So for instance, let's say that you want to add, something like a grid on a page, right? So that usually implies that you would want to add a div. We are not covering the grid in particular today. We're going to use the grid as a tool to demonstrate how the Kendo DataSource works. So let's say that you have a grid, and let's say that you have a script tag on your page that you will use to get started. So usually, as you might know, when you're using Kendo UI, you're also relying on the power of jQuery. So that means that we can do something like this. And this is a shorthand for the DOM ready event in jQuery. Hello world, just to test out that everything is working. And there we go. So, if you want to turn a specific div into a grid, you can grab an instance of it. In this case, I call it grid, and we can generate the Kendo grid, right? So it doesn't show anything, of course, but we can see that we're almost ready to kind of start doing relevant things. So for instance, a grid usually will have some kind of columns, and it will of course also have some data. So let's say that we are building something like a maybe like a sales dashboard, for instance. So I do that, and we're on our way. So at this point, of course, we want to have the grid showcase some data. So this is where the Kendo DataSource actually comes into play, and this is actually a good point to demonstrate that even though the grid has a data source property that you can set to just a plain array, what that does internally, if you happen to just set it as an array, is that it will turn it into a Kendo Kendo.data source, which is an instance of the data source object that we're going to be covering. But let's say that we want to get something very quick and dirty on the page, so we can add something like a let's see, maybe we want to have a field of month with the title month. Something like that. I like to keep the actual properties lowercase, but I want to have the title uppercase, right? So we can start adding more properties to this thing. Maybe it's a sales dashboard that's going to show how many video games were sold and how many DVDs were sold and how many Blu-rays were sold, right? So we do the same kind of thing. Actually want to keep some spacing here. Clean this up a bit. There we go. So that'll be video games. That'll be, and these are the columns, by the way, not the data source. These are the columns of the grid. We'll add the data source in a bit. So now we got our 4 columns: DVDs, Blu-rays, All right, so we got a particular month, how many video games were sold, how many DVDs were sold, and how many Blu-rays were sold. Okay, so now we need some data to actually show this. So the grid also has a data source property that we could set to an array, and let's say that for the month of January, we sold $10,000, we could say, worth of video games and DVDs. It could be 12,000, and Blu-rays we sold. There we go. So that was January. And let's expand that a bit, maybe do a couple more months. April, March, February, March, April. And there we go. Let's change the data a bit. All right. So as you can see, we already have something very quick and dirty, but it's working. We have a grid and it's showing some data. But this is where it gets interesting, right? This is the data source right here. It's just a plain array. So one quick step that we could take at this point, really, to start maybe abstracting away the actual data access part of the grid would be to essentially turn this into something like my data array, right? And then I can have a var my data array equal to the array that we had there. Clean it up a bit again. And we're on the same situation as before, but now the grid is only concerned with setting the data source and configuring its own columns. But it's not actually setting, doing the data retrieval mechanism as part of the grid configuration. It is just a variable that is being received on the grid at the point of its instantiation. So now we have a data source array. Now the thing is, of course, that let's say that we want to make the grid potentially something like filterable, right? We make it filterable, and that already kind of implies that the grid is going to rely on the data source to perform such filtering, right? In this case, for instance, I can come in here and say that I want months that have the Y letter on it for some reason, right? And that gives me this too. So this is good because this is text, but maybe I want greater than or less than, and what I'm getting here is contains. Now this doesn't quite make any sense because I am talking about numerical stuff here. So I need to be able to configure the data source so that it understands that this is these are numbers. So I should be able to get operators that are related to numerical values, right? So one way to do this is, instead of relying on this data array and then the grid internally figuring out how that actually translates into a Kendo data source, is we can create our own actual instance of a data source. So for instance, I can do var my data source, and I'll set it to a new Kendo.data. And this is the namespace where the actual data source object is stored. So here's the data source, and I would use, of course, this data source instead of the data array. Let me define the data source actually below the array, because I'm going to use it. I'm going to use that array as part of the data source. So the data source object has a data property that I would set then to my data array. And by doing this, I haven't done anything yet, but I'm gonna change the grid to use that my data source, and everything still works the same, but we still have the same problem, right? It still says contains. So now this is where I can start adding and giving some context to the grid on what the actual object is in there, and that's part of what we call the data source schema. And by the way, if you want to know what are the properties that you can set here, right? Like what can you set here, right? You want to go to the DataSources API reference, which is right here. So this is where I could find, for instance, what I'm going to use right now, which is the schema.model property. So to get back to it, instead of what, it'll be schema. And schema really is an object that also has a bunch of properties in there. But in particular right now, I care about the model. So the model will have a bunch of fields. And this is where I can tell it that, for instance, that the month is of type string, but that's the only one, because the rest I can set to be, for instance, type number, and these are video games, DVDs, and Blu-rays. And that should change this now to have, as you can see, is not equal to is greater than, right? So I can now do something like 11,000 is greater than, and there we go, which is an operator that we don't get for a string. So this is cool. Another interesting thing about the data source is that now that it's abstracted away as we have it now it can then in theory be used by another widget, right? So potentially I might want to let's say add a, what could it be? It could be a chart. We could add a chart to this. Now of course, to add a chart, the process is fairly similar. We add a div to the page, and in this case it'll be a chart. Probably want to add a little bit of room here so the chart can have its own space. But the process is, as usual, oops, we take an instance of such HTML element, in this case a chart. And by the way, if you have any questions, you can put it on the questions tab on your GoToWebinar controls. I don't see any questions yet, but just in case. All right, what was I doing? I was going to add a chart. There we go. So the process is similar. We want to add a Kendo chart. Now this, of course, is not going to do anything because there isn't anything to chart. But I could, you know, the idea is that I want to reuse the exact same data source because I want to chart how this kind of looks. All right. So as usual, the first thing that matters is the data source for the chart. This is what it's going to use to plot things. So in this case, I added the data source. Of course, it doesn't do anything yet, because just like the grid, where you set columns to it, the chart needs the series that it's going to plot. So the series in this case is going to be, oops, series is actually an array, and the series is going to be, it should be the video games and the DVDs, of course. Yeah. So that means that I need the name of the series and the field that I wanted to use from the data source. The field is, of course, video games, just like the data source has, video games. Just by doing that, it should do something. There we go. It starts to plot things. Let's do it for the DVDs and for the Blu-rays. No. Video games, DVDs, and Blu-rays. Feel free to put the questions on the chat on the questions tab, and we'll cover all of them at the end. I just wanted to make sure that if any question actually arises, just ask it, and we'll cover all of them at the end of the talk. Okay, so video games, DVDs, and Blu-rays. DVDs and Blu-rays. There we go. Now, actually, the thing that's missing, of course, is what is the other axis here, and we are talking about category axis. In this case, it's going to be, of course, the month, because that's what we're trying to figure out, what's performing better when. So now we have January, February, March, and April. Now, one thing is that I think this might actually look a bit nicer if we were using line instead of columns. So I think we can set that default for all of the different series. I could go ahead and each series give it a type, but in this case it's going to apply to all of those. So I can set it to be line. Again, you don't have to know all of this by heart. The Kendo charts API reference, here we go, is also cover all of this in detail. This one is actually a very complex object, so it's got all kinds of functionality in there. But in this case, I'm just looking for the series defaults, which should be series defaults right here. Series defaults. All right, so yeah, now we have the line charts. Now what's good here is that now, for instance, even if I were to make maybe like I only care right now about January, right? And just doing that now, it also, even though I did an operation on the actual grid, it also worked on the chart. So at this point, we are sharing, a data source. Both objects basically have as an input the data source that they're going to use. That applies for the grid, and it applies for the data source. I want to make this look a little bit nicer, actually. So let me clean up some of this stuff. I don't need the mobile. I don't need the right to left. I want to use the, I think, material is what I'm looking for. The material theme looks very nice in my opinion. And that makes the grid look different, but it actually didn't change the chart. And that's because since the chart relies on internal browser APIs like SVG or Canvas, that's actually an input on it. So you want to make the chart explicitly material theme. Now it looks nicer. Of course, I can also do, instead of just relying on the operators, because the chart doesn't have any way to like do anything special that would affect the grid. But maybe I can have, let's say between the two, I want to add, some kind of special button that you would add to your UI for some reason. And it's a button that says, click me. And we want it to look nice, of course, so we can always add the nice and handy CSS classes that Kendo provides. I think in this case I'm looking for K button. There we go. And actually I think there is a, what is it? I think it's K primary. There we go. So now it looks a little bit nicer. Let's add another break here. Now what I want to do is I want to capture the click event of that button. Button. And what I'll do is capture the click event of the button. Just in case, is it working? It is. All right, so at this point, I can perform operations. Instead of thinking about what should I do with the grid or what should I do with the data source, I can actually, let's say that I want to filter, right, on the data source. Now, the data source is its own object. It's what we call a non-UI widget that's part of Kendo UI. So it also benefits from many of the features of Kendo UI, and that includes, you know, a very rich API reference, so you can kind of go and see what is possible with it. There's a bunch of methods that you can invoke on the data source. For instance, the filter method, right? So if you have an instance of a data source, you can call filter on it, and whatever widget is bound to that data source, it's going to reflect that filter operation. So if we go back to our dojo here, just copy that, we see that we don't call it data source, we have it as my data source. That's the name of our variable. So you have an instance of the variable right here. Then we invoke the filter method, and then we want to do, sure, starts with J. Actually, let's do something with the video games, for instance. Instead of starts with, let's do greater than. And that's going to be the video games. And I want the value to be greater than 11,000. And that is on the click event of the button. So now you see we only have February, and again, the chart is also reflecting only February. All right, so what we have seen so far is just, of course, the data source working in mostly a local kind of data source environment. Of course, you could extrapolate this and change it to something else, but the data source actually works also as a proxy, as really a nice service layer, if you can think about it that way, between the widget and a remote server. So the same principles apply. You know, it's kind of like a wrapper for you to interact, for the widget to interact with data. But how the data source actually gets its data to feed it to the widgets, it's up to it, right? It's up to the data source. So that means that I could change this so that it will interact with a remote endpoint. So for that, I am actually going to, you know, I'm going to rely on a JSON-based server that I've set up. So actually, I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code and show something maybe more real-life scenario. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up this application that I have here. Bear with me for a second as I move things to the correct side of the screen. I don't need this now. Let me just go ahead and I think this is the command. And that is going to open up a little server that I have running on localhost 5000. Go back to the browser. This is not it. There we go, found it. This is it. All right, so as you can see, we have nothing here, only a little title, and I guess it alerts hello when it starts. And that is because the only thing I have in my HTML is, this is constructed from a layout file, of course, that kind of sets up the actual CSS and JavaScript files needed, and the the actual HTML architecture. But what you end up getting is simply this page with home, about, and contact. It only has a title, as we see right here. Can change it just to test that everything is working right. Change it and reload. And we also have hello webinar, because the document ready function is executing hello webinar. So at this point, the reason to move to a Visual Studio Code environment and more of a ASP.NET environment is only for the backend. We're not really focusing on server-side oriented architectures at all, but we are using a JSON endpoint, and I wanted to build that with ASP.NET. In this case, it could have really been built with any technology, because I wanted to demonstrate how the data source can interact with any JSON endpoint. So we do have a few endpoints that we can play with. For instance, we have the sales read sales read action right here, and if I go to that URL, that's going to be sales read. We should have data that looks somewhat similar to what we were looking at before: January, video games, DVDs, and Blu-rays, etc. So we should be able to get the grid now to interact and to list as a grid data table this kind of data, but now retrieving it from a remote endpoint. So let's go ahead and get started by cleaning up that alert box that we don't need anymore. And actually, let's get started by copying what we had on the dojo that we were just working on, right? So we had a grid and a chart, if I remember correctly. Let's actually copy that right here. That's going to give us a grid. It's going to give us a chart. Of course, it's not doing anything yet. So on the code, we had a data array. I'm copying it from the other side, but it's going to be the exact code that we were just working on, so that we get into a similar state as we were before. So with that, go back to this, and here we go. We have the same thing as before, but of course this is still very much local data that we see right here. Now we want to change this so that it will consume that packet. So the first thing, of course, is that we don't need the data array anymore. We actually don't need the data property either, because now this is going to be fetched from a backend, right? So that means that I don't need this. We're going to rely on, let me go back to the API reference of the data source so that you can see it. We are going to rely on a particular property of the data source, and this one is called the transport property. The transport is where you set the specific configuration on how it's going to read data, how it's going to potentially, it depends on what you're building, of course, but how it's going to communicate with the server when it needs to add new data, and when it needs to delete data, and when it needs to update data. Everything is part of the transport, but it really, it can look like it's got all kinds of functions, but really that's what matters. This is where you set the 4 URLs really for the server. Now in the particular case of this sample, but this is only a little tool that kind of makes things easier, I'm going to let the data source know that I'm using ASP.NET MVC. This is essentially so that it knows how to serialize the data in a way that the MVC controller accepts it. Now, this is only because the MVC controller that I have in place is using this helper method to kind of serialize and deserialize the data source requests and data source responses, but it really isn't necessary. It just saves a little bit of configuration that we might not need to write. But what matters is the transport. This is what matters, and this applies to any kind of backends, really. The transport is where you set read URL, and in this case, like I mentioned, it's going to be sales read. And one thing that I can recommend, by the way, as we do this, is to always have the DevTools open, so you can see exactly what might be going on, because this is, this is something that takes a lot of, nip and tuck in a way, so that you're getting it right, so you can see what actually is happening. In this case, as you can see, I have it in syntax error somewhere. Oh, missing a comma right here. That should be that. See if there's anything else. Okay, so now we can see that it actually made the sales read request, and it got this response. Now, what is missing about it? Oh, of course. Now, the thing is that we can see that the response comes back, and it's got this, let's see it in the actual response. Here we go. We can see that it is all nested under a data property, alongside some other things. But what matters is the actual data property that we see right here. So the grid doesn't know where to look for the data on that big JSON response that it received. So that's also something that you would set on the schema. You know how we set the model for the schema? You also want to let the grid know what is the name of the property on the JSON, right? In this case, it's going to actually be data. That should get us a working grid. There we go. Now I actually see January, February, and March. This is coming from the backend. I can show the backend again. On the read operations, I am essentially grabbing the sales from the database and feeding that as JSON back to the grid. So this is not really pertinent to what we're doing now, but the point is that this is a completely dynamic environment now. Oops. So now we have set, just one thing, by the way, that I'm not entirely happy with. First of all, if I clear this, for some reason, we are getting two operations, right? And that is not what we wanted. It should only make one request to the server, but the grid is doing one, and I guess the chart is doing the other one, because as you know, they're both using the same data source, which in turn is going to the server to perform that, the data retrieval. Let's clean this up a bit. Okay. And one more. Perfect. All right, so one way that we can avoid that is that we can tell the grid to not auto-bind. Essentially meaning do not interact with the data source on your own. Don't force the data source to do anything. That's one way to do it. And in fact, if I only do that, it's actually going to only make one request. It's not ideal what's going to happen, but you'll see that only one request will happen, and that is because, what did I do? Expected token, oh, auto bind false. Only one request must have gone to the server, and that's because the chart is the one that's initiating it, and then the grid also kind of picks up on it, and now that the data source is populated, then it also uses that data. But this is not ideal. You probably also want to set the chart not to auto-bind. And now, of course, nothing is going to happen. The data source is not going to show anything, and neither is the chart. But then we can interact directly with the data source, which is right here, and just call the read method. Now, so at this point, neither the grid nor the chart is forcing the grid to perform its initial fetch operation, it's going to be its own thing. It's going to be my code really invoking the data source read operation, which will trigger a trickle down for both the grid and the chart. So just by doing that, now we should have the desired outcome of only one network request being sent to the server. But there's a second thing that I don't like. I particularly prefer the method to be a GET request when it comes to my backend. In fact, I think I should be able to force that. Let me stop this server, and if I'm doing this correctly, HTTP GET, and run this again. Just by doing that, I think I should have purposefully, of course, broken this demo. But I just think it makes for a more robust setup. In my opinion, you should use HTTP GET for reading data and not POST. POST is for adding new data. So as you can see, now it's getting a 404. It's saying I could the server is saying there is no endpoint that is accepting a POST request with that URL. There is one for GET, of course. So now we need to tell the data source to make use of the correct verb. And again, this can completely be set via the transport. So the read, instead of setting it as a string, which is a valid approach, you can actually set it as an object that's got more properties. So the URL is only one of the properties that we were setting by default there, but we can set also the method. And the method can be GET, and by doing that, oops, hitting refresh, now it's again fetching data, and now everything is working. So I actually want to make use of all the 4 potential operations on the grid. So let's say that I want to have the grid potentially be editable. First of all, turn that into true. I also want to make sure that there is a button to edit in the first place, right? Because there is no approach to do that here. So to do that, what you want to do is you want to add an extra column. I like to use, instead of editable, actually, I want to use editable inline because I want to edit one item at a time. This could be set for more advanced scenarios if you want to do batch edit and that kind of stuff. But for this sample, I'm only going to worry about editing one item at a time. So to do that, I need to add another column of the grid, and that's usually what they call a command column. So on that command column, I want to have 2 commands. One's going to be edit, and the other one is going to be destroy. Let's set the title to just not be anything, and the width to be maybe something like 200, something like that. Let's see what happens if I do that. There we go. Now we have the same grid, and now with an edit button. But of course, nothing is going to happen, right? At this point, if I try to do that, it's trying to post, but it's not even going to any specific URL. Nothing is really happening. Even though the grid is doing that, it doesn't mean anything, right? Nothing is happening because you're not hitting any particular URL. And we know that we have a update URL right here. So just like we did for the read operation, we can specify a update operation, right? Now that's going to be sales update. Now in the case of updating, you also don't want to do get, but you potentially don't want to do post. Some people do post, some people don't. I prefer to use the put, HTTP put, and that's what I am forcing on the controller. So by doing that, and if I'm doing this correctly, we should be able to modify the data, always keep an eye on the traffic and see what happens, and this has failed. The reason why it's failed is, and it's important to figure out, always look at the request and look at the response. In this case, it is sending the new data that I set, and it's sending, you know, all kinds of information, but it's actually not sending the most important piece, and that is the ID. So it doesn't know which of the items to edit, and that is because my schema, my somewhat simplistic schema that we were using for the previous demo, did not have the very important ID property set. And I believe and hope that is the cause of that error, but let's just try it again. All right, oops. Keep that open, go to the network, and do it again, update, and there we go. We have changed this to 15, let's change it to 5,000, change it again, and just to prove that it's working, let's just refresh the whole thing, and now it is 5,000. So now we have both the reading and updating of items. Of course, I can also change the text, and let's refresh it to prove that it's working. It is. Change it back to just regular March. Now, as you can see, and it's fairly straightforward, we can add more things now for potentially adding new items. To do that, you want to have, the grid has a very nice way of adding a add button on the toolbar. So I can add a create button on the toolbar. And there we go. Now we can add a new record. I believe that's all that we need to do, but let's keep an eye on the traffic. Add new record. I guess we could use April and do 12,000, 11,000, and 9,000. Update that. We've made a post request now. This one, oh, it's not going to work, of course, because I haven't set the endpoint for it. So now we create. We also have sales create. In this case, I do want to finally use post. There we go. I didn't create anything, but now hopefully it will. There we go. Now it's created something. So now we have April right here at the top. It puts it at the top. That's the default of the grid. You could modify that or sort it by different criteria. But the point is that now we do have April. So now we are reading, of course, we're editing, we're creating, and now we're just missing deleting. Now it also has, it's got the button already, but again, we know that it's not going to work because there isn't a URL for it to go to delete things. But now it's as simple as copy and pasting this. This is called the destroy operation on the data source. I believe this is destroy. Let me double check. Destroy, yes, destroy. And the method is actually going to be delete. So now we're using all 4 HTTP verbs, as I call it. Get, post, put, and delete. There's more, of course, but these are the 4 important ones for CRUD operations. So doing that, keeping the traffic open, clearing everything we don't need, and doing, let's delete April. It should have made a delete operation on the sales destroy endpoint, and now we should only have January, February, and March, as we do. All right. Another nice thing that I haven't touched on is the fact that we can do sorting operations, right? But what if we actually want to do those on the server? Right now, everything that we have seen is happening on the client. As you can see, there's no network traffic coming in and out. But at some point, you do want to perform those operations potentially on the server. And the same for the filtering stuff. Maybe I can do that. So this, of course, takes a little bit more work, essentially because then the server needs to be able to accept requests that are asking for specific things. It's not just asking, hey, give me the data, right? It's asking, give me the data, but only give me the data with this criteria or sorted by this information or filtered by this information. So this is where, of course, it's up to you to build a proper server that will be able to accept those things, but the grid can certainly ask for it, right? So to do that, we already have the grid asking for setting it as things are filterable and things are sortable, as we see right here. But we can also set the data source to be server filtering instead of client-side filtering. Server filtering, true, and server sorting, true. And just by doing that and inspecting the traffic, network tab, inspecting the traffic, now we see that every time that I try to sort, it goes back to the server and it requests things. If we actually look at the details of this, there's a query string parameter being sent with the name of month as a property and then ascending. And it could also be, of course, month ascending, month descending, as we see right here. It's actually put as part of the query string because we are using get. If we were using post, it would be part of the body of the HTTP post request. All right, so that is about what I had to cover. As you can see, the grid, it's very powerful. The data source is very powerful. You can configure it to do all kinds of operations, be that on the local kind of approach or do it entirely on the server side. One thing that I can mention here, by the way, is that many of these things can be set to actually be functions. So let's say that you want to you want to use some kind of client-side SDK. Maybe you want to use Firebase, or you want to use any kind of Telerik backend services. You want to use something like Convey. You want to use Azure mobile services, Amazon mobile services, things like that. And those come with a JavaScript-based client SDK. You can turn these things into a function and then perform the operation there. So for instance, options. Let's say that you have SDK .read .something, and you have the data here. What matters is that at the end of the day, you invoke the options.success method, passing it the data object that will be needed for the grid to work, right? So for instance, let's say that this is an empty data object. Let's see what I'm doing here. Of course, it might fail because there's some requirements here, but this looks like something else. Oops. Read function. Oh, okay. One thing that I'm missing this comma here. Bring it back. Data is going to be an empty array. That should be it. And there we go. Of course, it's got no information, but I could set it to have, month again. do that again. Month data array. Yeah, one thing to keep in mind, by the way, if you're going to use this approach, all 4 operations need to be functions. So if you are going to use like an external SDK or something like that, you want to make sure that that all 4 operations are a function. So I just wanted to demonstrate that in the case, because we often get the question, how do I use this SDK or that SDK? The trick is to use, instead of just setting the transport CRUD operations as objects, you set them as functions. And then the functions execute whatever code, and then they invoke the options.success with the actual JSON object that's needed for the for it to work out. So that's about what I wanted to show. Let's get this back to a working state. There we go. So yeah, at this point, I do want to take some questions. So let me open up the tab that I have for the questions. And bear with me for a second as I find the questions tab here. Okay, the first one that I see here is, what is the limit of data maximum in the data source? So this is a good question. Usually what matters really more than the data source is what kind of HTML and what kind of content you're going to be putting on your page. So you could foresee this, of course, there's only 12 months in a year, so that shouldn't be a problem. But if we were showing, thousands or maybe millions of records, you want to do pagination, because at some point, regardless of the limitations here and there, the browser is going to crash and your machine is going to run out of memory. So you want to use pagination. So let's say that on my database I had, millions of records. What you want to do is just retrieve them in batches. You get, 40 at a time or 100 at a time or something like that. And that can totally be said if you're using something like the Kendo grid. It's got built-in support for pagination, and then of course in this case it's going to be server-side pagination. So just like we were doing server filtering, you can do server paging. True. Now of course at this point you need to set the size of each page and the grid to actually be pageable, etc. But the data source has full support for pagination, which is the solution to use large amounts of records, because there isn't a predetermined maximum. We don't have a number to give out like, oh yeah, you can't use more than 10,000 or something like that. The answer is really just make sure that you're not feeding too much data to the browser, because at some point it's just going to be too much of a burden on your clients. All right. Then I also have, is it possible to extend the data source in any way? Sure. So it depends exactly what you mean by extend. Usually we recommend that you make use of the very extensive API that's on it. But there is, for instance, the concept of the scheduler data source and the hierarchical data source. So, and those are classes that extend from the data source, but it does take, a little bit of advanced coding to actually do that. So it is possible. It's just something that we don't see, the broader set of developers using it, because the API is very extensive. Okay, what else do we have here? What about MasterDetail scenarios? So MasterDetail is interesting because in those cases, let's say that we're talking, and we do have samples of that, by the way. Let me go to the Kendo grid demo. So we'll see especially when it pertains to the data source, it really is, it would be too complicated for those two things to actually use the exact same data source, because the data source, if you were talking about the same two widgets sharing the data source in a master detail scenario, that is not exactly what's happening. They are actually showing very different data. So we can see that the master grid has a data source. It's got a transport set. In this case, it's an OData feed, and this is the URL for that. But then the nested grid has its own data source. So for a master detail scenario, I wouldn't recommend that you use the exact same data source. Now, the the data source that's inside of for the child grid, for instance, could kind of, for instance, in this case, it filters by default based on the master, right? But the URL is orders, and it's filtering by employee ID. So that's how you get this list of employees, but then list of orders. So you have an employee data source and an orders data source. All right. Let's see, fourth question. How can I ensure that all components that are bound to a data source are updated when I change the values in the array? Both ways. It happens by default. If it's not happening, something is wrong. Every time that on the sample that we were working on, if I come in here and change this to 100 or something like that, just by doing that, we can see that the chart is also changing. So this is why this one is all the way down here at 100. So each item should update the values when you change it. Okay, what is add section scripts? This is a for everybody else, by the way. What they're asking is, what is this? This is a ASP.NET specific concept. It's a section. So on my layout file, there should be a section called scripts. You find it right here. So if I want to add things at the bottom of the page, for instance, or wherever the section is, I can use section scripts, and then it puts stuff there. And that is what I do, so that the final outcome of the HTML has my JavaScript code at the bottom. It's just a little trick that ASP.NET MVC has. This is not in any way related to Kendo, of course. Okay. What else do we have? How to best implement a scenario. Kendo widgets bound to local array and updating it. Array will be synced back to the server using Ajax. Yeah, I mean, it would have to be, at this point, I would recommend using the approach that we were talking about before. When you want to do custom things like that, really the recommended approach is to keep using the transport, but in this, just turn everything into a function, so that when you read, you return from the URL. When you update, you perform an operation on the array, on the array, etc. So but it's up to you to determine at what point do you save to the server. Is it every time that you make a change? Is it every time that that you hit some kind of button, etc.? But using function is the most flexible way, because it allows you to do anything. I have seen, and in fact, I have blogged about it. I can send a link to it's somewhat of an outdated blog post, but I use the transport to communicate with an Azure mobile backend service, and essentially just makes use of the client SDK that they have. So you can always turn any of this into functions and do any operation there. But you probably want to consider why you would want to do that. If you can just have the grid do what it's supposed to do, and the data source do what it's supposed to do, which is essentially communicate to the server. You're adding an extra level of complexity, but if there's a reason for it, go right ahead. But I would encourage you to make use of the features that come out of the box with the tool, because it makes your life easier. How can I access the data in a data source using JavaScript? Is it possible to change the data in a data source using JavaScript and then make a grid aware of the change? Yes, of course. The data source is a very rich API. One of the methods that you have is actually called data, and this gives you the data that's in it, and if you modify it and then call the sync method on it, you can modify it completely with code. So you don't have to rely on a widget. You can always, of course, use the the API of it, and via code you can, as you can see in this sample, in fact, you can set the unit price now to 20, and then have another product set it also to 20, and then sync it. In fact, it's removing stuff, so it's very involved demo here, but the point is that you can do it entirely via code. You grab an instance of a data source, you grab the items that you want to modify, you modify the items, and then you sync it, and that's going to perform the remote operation on the server. All right. Can I bind a data source to a local array? Yes, as we were doing in the very first sample that we worked on, that was using a local array. If you set up pagination for your data source and you have a chart sharing that data source, will the chart only show information relevant to the current page of data? That is correct. Yes, the chart will only show what's currently in the view of the data source. So at that point, if you don't want that to happen, then you can kind of set up a separate data source if needed. Those are scenarios when they're strictly bound to each other. If you want things to happen on one widget but not the other, then don't use the same data source. All right. But what is if I bind the grid and the chart to a local array? But what is if I bind the grid and the chart to a local array? Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand the question. The very first sample that we worked on was just open it again. We have a grid and a chart bound to the local array, but through the data source object. Like I said, the grid actually creates a data source internally, no matter what you feed it. But yes, we are here binding the grid and the chart to a local array. Scenario. I have a local array. I bind two grids to it. I change the array. Will the grids get notified about the change? If you only modify the actual array and not through the data source API that the grid is using, or just through the grid itself, then no, there's no way for the widgets to know that. All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for joining. It's certainly been a fun set of questions. And of course, I mean, I do understand that this can get, imaginations can run wild on all kinds of scenarios. So of course, I mean, it always depends specifically on what you want to implement. But hopefully this gave you a good idea on what it is that you can do with the data source, and especially, that's why I like to keep the the console and the dev tools open, so you can see me messing up, and you can avoid it when that happens to you. And also it's important to know where to look for things when you're kind of adding network operations and adding new functionality. So it's always it's good to see somebody else demonstrate that. So I hope it worked out. So I think we are about of time. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.